Dale Evans and Roy Rogers were supposed to be perfect. To millions of Americans, they were the dream couple. He was the king of the cowboys. She was the glamorous cowgirl who could sing, ride, act, and smile beside him as if nothing in the world could ever go wrong. Together, they built one of Hollywood's most famous families. They shared movies. They shared television screens. They raised children. They traveled the country. And for more than 5 decades, they remained together. But behind that perfect Western image was a woman who had already spent most of her life fighting battles the public never saw. Dale Evans knew what it felt like to be abandoned. She knew what it meant to raise a child before she was ready. She knew what it felt like when Hollywood told her which parts of her own life she was allowed to reveal. And later, she would experience the kind of family tragedies that could break even the strongest person. So when people say Dale Evans hated Roy Rogers more than anyone, the truth is actually much more complicated. Because Dale did love Roy. But love does not mean there is never anger. It does not mean there is never disappointment. And it certainly does not mean a marriage can survive more than 50 years without wounds. The real story is about the side of Dale Evans that America rarely saw. And it begins long before Roy Rogers ever entered her life. The girl behind Dale Evans. Before she became Dale Evans, she was Frances Octavia Smith. She was born on October 31, 1912, in Uvalde, Texas. Her childhood was far removed from the glamorous Hollywood world she would eventually enter. For part of her childhood, she lived with her uncle in Arkansas. And although she had a place to live, there was something missing. The warmth and security of a normal family. That feeling of loneliness would follow her into adulthood. Then, when Frances was only 14 years old, she ran away and secretly married Thomas F. Fox. She was still a child herself. But just 1 year later, she became a mother. Her son, Thomas F. Fox Jr., was born when she was only 15. Suddenly, a teenage girl had an infant depending on her. And then, when Frances was only 16, her husband left. Think about that for a moment. At an age when most teenagers were worrying about school, friends, and what they would do with their lives, Frances was trying to figure out how to raise a child. She had very little money. She had no major career. And she had almost nobody to depend on. But she refused to give up. She turned to music. Frances began singing and playing piano at radio stations in Memphis. At first, fame was not the goal. Survival was. Every paycheck helped her provide for her son. Every performance gave her another reason to keep going. Eventually, her radio career took her to Louisville, Kentucky. There, a station manager decided that Frances Octavia Smith was simply too long for a radio personality. He suggested a new name, Dale Evans. And that name would eventually become famous across America. But Hollywood had its own rules. And one of those rules created a painful secret. Dale was a teenage mother. Hollywood executives believed that being a young mother could damage the image of a female star. So Tommy was not publicly presented as Dale's son. He was presented as her younger brother. Imagine the emotional cost. The boy she had raised. The child she had worked for. The reason she had pushed herself through difficult years. She could not openly tell America that he was her son. She had already lost control of her family life once. Now Hollywood was controlling the story again. Dale accepted it because she believed her career and her son's future depended on it. But that experience taught her something she would never forget. The public image was not always the truth. And that lesson would become very important later. Because when Dale eventually married America's favorite cowboy, the public would once again see a perfect picture. But Dale knew that perfect pictures could hide painful realities. When Roy Rogers walked into her life, by the time Dale Evans met Roy Rogers, she had already lived through more than most people experience in a lifetime. She was a mother, a singer, a rising entertainer, and a woman who had fought her way into Hollywood. Then, in 1944, she appeared alongside Roy Rogers in The Cowboy and the Senorita. Roy was already a major star. He was known as the king of the cowboys. Families loved him. Children looked up to him. Adults trusted his wholesome image. He represented everything Hollywood wanted a Western hero to represent. courage, family, honor, good values. But behind Roy's public image was a man dealing with his own tragedy. Before Dale, Roy had been married to Arlene Wilkins. They had children together. Then, in 1946, Arlene gave birth to their son, Roy Rogers Jr., later known as Dusty. Tragically, Arlene died suddenly after giving birth. Roy was left devastated. He was now a widower with young children, and Dale understood something about his situation. She knew what it was like to have a child depending on you while your own life was falling apart. She knew what abandonment felt like. She knew the fear of having to survive without enough support. Their connection slowly became deeper. What began as a professional partnership became something personal. Then came the proposal. According to the story surrounding their relationship, Roy proposed while sitting on his famous horse, Trigger, shortly before entering a rodeo arena in Chicago. Thousands of people were there. Dale said yes. And on December 31st, 1947, Roy Rogers and Dale Evans were married. For Dale, this was not simply a Hollywood romance. It was the chance to build the family she had always wanted. Roy accepted Tommy. Dale became part of Roy's existing family. And together, they began building something much larger. Their household eventually included biological and adopted children. From the outside, it looked almost magical. The king of the cowboys had married the queen of the West. America loved them. But inside that family was something cameras could never fully capture. Responsibility, pressure, loss, and two very strong personalities trying to raise a large family while maintaining two demanding careers. The dream was real, but so were the problems. The child who changed Dale forever. In 1950, Dale became pregnant with her first biological child with Roy. For a woman who had spent so much of her life fighting for family, the moment must have carried enormous hope. Their daughter, Robin Elizabeth Rogers, was born that year. But Robin had Down syndrome and serious health problems. At that time, society viewed children with disabilities very differently. Many families faced ignorance and shame. Some were even encouraged to place disabled children in institutions. Hollywood created another layer of pressure. Roy and Dale were supposed to represent the perfect American family. There were people who believed Robin should remain private. But Dale refused to hide her daughter. And that decision was deeply personal. Years earlier, Hollywood had forced her to hide Tommy. She had been told that her own son could not publicly be identified as her son. Dale was not going to let history repeat itself. Robin was her daughter, and she would be loved openly. But Dale did not get the future she dreamed about. Robin died in 1952 before reaching her second birthday. For Dale, the loss was devastating. She had already experienced abandonment. She had already struggled as a teenage mother. Now she had lost a child. But instead of allowing Robin's life to disappear into silence, Dale wrote about her. In 1953, she published Angel Unaware. The book was deeply personal. Dale presented Robin's story through an imagined voice, giving the child a way to speak about her brief life. And something unexpected happened. Parents of children with disabilities began writing to Dale. They shared their own stories, their fear, their loneliness, their shame, their struggles. Dale's grief had become something larger. She was using her pain to help other families. But privately, the loss remained. And this is where we begin to understand the woman behind the smile. Dale could be strong in public and still be broken inside. She could sing about faith while privately asking why terrible things happened. She could smile beside Roy while carrying grief that never completely disappeared. And her family was still growing. The perfect couple wasn't so perfect. From 1951 to 1957, the Roy Rogers Show became a major television program. Every week, families saw Roy and Dale together. They sang. They acted. They rode horses. They represented wholesome American values. To viewers, they looked almost inseparable. But television only showed a few minutes of their lives. The cameras did not show the mornings. They did not show the arguments. They did not show the exhaustion. They did not show the parenting decisions. And they certainly did not show what happened when Roy and Dale disagreed. Their family was large. Their children came from different backgrounds. Some had already experienced difficult circumstances, and raising a family that large required constant work. Roy also had a demanding career. He had filming, tours, rodeos, performances, public appearances, travel. His career made him famous. But that same career could also keep him away from home. And this is where Dale's frustrations could grow. She was not simply Roy's wife. She was a mother. She was an actress. She was a singer. She was responsible for children who needed her. And when Roy was away, someone still had to keep everything running. There was food. There were schedules. There were emotional problems. There were children who needed attention. And there was the pressure of maintaining the public image of the perfect Western family. According to the source material, Roy could also be strict with the children. He had strong ideas about discipline. He expected rules to be followed. From his perspective, he may have believed he was doing what a father was supposed to do. But Dale was deeply involved in the day-to-day reality of raising those children. So the same rules could feel very different to her. This is why the word hate can be misleading. There is no evidence here that Dale simply hated Roy. Their marriage lasted more than 50 years. They continued to work together. They remained devoted to their family. The truth was more human. Dale could love Roy and still be angry with him. She could appreciate everything he had done and still resent the things he had not done. She could admire his career while wishing he had spent more time at home. She could respect him as a father while disagreeing with his discipline. And because Roy Rogers was America's beloved cowboy, Dale could not simply go on television and tell the world everything she felt. Millions of people wanted to believe Roy and Dale were perfect. So the public saw the smiles. Dale lived with the reality. And then came another tragedy. One that would test both of them beyond anything they had experienced before. The second child she lost. In 1964, the Rogers-Evans family suffered another devastating loss. Their adopted daughter Debbie was only 12 years old when she died in a church bus accident. There was no long illness, no warning, no time to prepare. One moment she was a child living her life. Then she was gone. For Dale, this was another unbearable loss. She had already lost Robin. Now another daughter had died. And grief does something to a family. It changes the way people see everything. Parent may ask questions that have no answers. Why did this happen? What could have been different? Why her? Why us? And even when two parents suffer the same loss, they do not always grieve the same way. One may want to talk. The other may become silent. One may need to stay surrounded by people. The other may want to disappear. For a marriage already carrying years of pressure, another tragedy could make every old frustration feel heavier. Eventually, Roy and Dale left their home at Chatsworth Ranch. They moved to the Double Bar Ranch in Apple Valley, California. Maybe a new place could help. Maybe new surroundings could make the pain easier to carry. But grief does not stay behind when you move. Robin was still gone. Debbie was still gone. And the responsibilities of life continued. The children who remained still needed their parents. The careers continued. The public still expected Roy and Dale to smile. But something inside Dale had changed. She became more open about pain. More willing to discuss grief. More willing to admit that faith did not mean a person never suffered. But real life had given her questions. Terrible questions. Questions about children, marriage, loss, family, and God. She could believe deeply and still hurt. She could have faith and still feel exhausted. She could love her husband and still be angry with him. What Dale really felt about Roy. So did Dale Evans hate Roy Rogers? The simplest answer is no. At least, the story supported by the source material does not show a woman who simply hated her husband. It shows something much more complicated. Dale had spent her entire life fighting for control over her own story. As a teenager, she had been forced to grow up quickly. As a mother, she had sacrificed for Tommy. As a Hollywood actress, she had been pressured to hide the truth about her own son. As a mother again, she fought to make sure Robin would never be treated as something to hide. And as a wife, she found herself married to one of America's biggest stars. That came with enormous advantages. But it also came with enormous pressure. Roy's fame meant their private lives were never completely private. Their marriage became part of their brand. Their family became part of their public image. Their happiness became something America expected to see. But nobody can be happy every day. And nobody can raise a large family without disagreements. Dale's frustration with Roy was likely shaped by everything happening around them. His absence, his strictness, the responsibilities placed on her, the emotional burden of raising children, the deaths of Robin and Debbie, the pressure of being America's perfect cowboy couple. None of those things automatically destroyed their marriage, but they could create resentment, and resentment can exist beside love. That is the part people often misunderstand. We like simple stories. We want heroes and villains. We want one person to be right and the other to be wrong. But real marriages rarely work that way. Roy Rogers was not simply a perfect husband, and Dale Evans was not simply a woman who hated him. They were two people who built a family, suffered unimaginable losses, carried enormous responsibilities, and remained together for decades. They hurt each other. They supported each other. They disagreed. They stayed. And that may be far more revealing than the Hollywood version of their marriage. The woman behind the smile. Dale Evans became famous because she knew how to perform. She knew how to sing. She knew how to act. She knew how to ride. And she knew how to smile. But her greatest performance may have been convincing America that everything was always fine. Because it wasn't. Her life contained abandonment, secret pain, career pressure, family tragedy, the death of 2 children, and the constant responsibility of maintaining a public image. Yet Dale continued. She continued working. She continued raising her family. She continued standing beside Roy. And she continued speaking about faith. That does not mean she never became angry. It does not mean she never cursed. It does not mean she never looked at Roy and wished he would change. It means she was human. And perhaps that is the real story behind the claim that Dale Evans hated Roy Rogers. The hatred was never as simple as the headline makes it sound. What existed was something much more complicated. A woman could love the man who accepted her son. She could love the father of her children. She could love the husband she spent more than 5 decades with. And at the same time, she could resent his absence. She could disagree with his parenting. She could feel overwhelmed. She could feel lonely. She could become furious. All of those emotions could live inside the same person. And perhaps that is why the public never truly understood Dale Evans. They knew the cowgirl. They knew the singer. They knew Roy Rogers' wife. They knew the woman who smiled beside America's favorite cowboy. But they did not always know Frances Octavia Smith, the teenage mother who had to grow up too quickly, the woman who fought to protect her son, the mother who refused to hide her daughter, the parent who buried 2 children, the wife who carried responsibilities behind the scenes, and the woman who learned that faith did not mean a life without pain. Dale Evans and Roy Rogers remained together for more than 50 years. That fact alone tells us something. Whatever anger existed, whatever disagreements they experienced, whatever frustrations Dale carried, there was also something strong enough to keep them together through extraordinary hardship. Their marriage was not perfect. Their family was not perfect. Their lives were not perfect. But perhaps that makes their story more powerful. Because behind the Western costumes, the horses, the songs, and the smiling television performances were 2 human beings trying to survive life together. And Dale Evans may never have been the woman America thought she was. She was stronger, more complicated, more wounded, and far more honest than the perfect image suggested. In the end, the real secret was not that Dale Evans hated Roy Rogers. It was that she could love him deeply while still carrying anger, disappointment, and pain that the public rarely got to see. And that is the side of Dale Evans that history almost forgot. The woman behind the smile, the mother behind the legend, and the wife behind America's favorite cowboy.